Hey, welcome back to the FBC podcast and back to the story. Hey, we're glad you're with us this week as we dive back into the story, Glen.
Yeah, here we are back again.
Yeah, you got a chance to preach through Daniel in exile.
Yeah.
And so we're going to get a chance today to just talk a little bit about the chapter, which people are probably reading this week and experiencing in their community groups and all the places where they engage the story. Daniel in exile, though, is this story of, obviously, God's people have been carried off to another land. Mm-hmm. A completely foreign culture to them is sort of the premise of this Daniel story, right? And I was thinking, where in our world do we have an experience like that? When was the last time you were in a completely foreign environment? Yeah. And I remembered that my good friend Glen Barnes spent a semester overseas in South Africa.
I didn't spend a semester. I spent a whole year.
Was it a whole year?
I spent a whole year as an exchange student.
What's it like to get dropped into a completely foreign culture and to have to process it all through little Santa Cruz Glen Barnes's mind?
Yeah, I was probably about Daniel's age. I don't think I was as smart as Daniel. Yeah, I was an exchange student. I lived for a year in South Africa when I was in high school, and the culture shock is so different. And there were a number of things. I actually lived with a Jewish family.
Oh, wow.
So I had like a number of different things.
Culture.
But everything from the food to the language to the, just the value system to then just, everything. So.
Right. The pace, a lot of times we hear in California, our pace of life is rather hectic. We're very pushed and driven. And you have people who go back to, not that anyone would ever watch this, those folks who move back to Tennessee or other places, you know what I mean? But there's a very real like culture disconnect from one place to another. Yeah. And I wonder, as Daniel is doing this, and even as we're thinking about our ever evolving culture, how do we process the changes in culture and see them through a lens of like God's eyes,
Yeah. Yeah, because obviously God's God of all culture.
Absolutely.
It's not like God's got one form of art or one form of music. He's all those things. But I think what Daniel experienced, and maybe this is where the filter comes through, is God at the center of the culture, or is God is pushed to the side? And this was a Babylonian culture. They like really prided themselves in culture. It was, the place of the art and the finest literature and but a lot of it was religious too. It was all the pantheon of idols.
But all religions.
All religions and, a million different idols. I mentioned in the sermon too, a lot of like occult stuff goes back to the worship of stars and stuff. A lot of that came from Babylon.
Straight out of Babylon. Yeah. It's interesting. I think what we'll do is we'll recap the story a little bit, and then maybe we will get back to your outline, which had some real applicable stuff throughout. But we jump into Daniel refuses to eat the meat, essentially. So should we all be vegetarian? Is that how this is?
I know that I was thinking about the Daniel diet, which I never did, but people loved that.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. But it worked for Daniel.
I know it did.
Yeah.
It did. And food's obviously one of those tricky things because we're not under the Old Testament law.
Right.
The law of Moses like he is. But I think, at some level, the stuff we put into our body, I think, alcohol is probably a good one to think of. It was the food. It was the king's food and wine. And made the decision on.
This is maybe not great news for Lodi with the wine industry, but alcohol consumption is at its lowest mark in generations. And so there's a layer of people trying to ask that question about what do we put into our body.
Yeah, younger generations are really seeing that there's not much health value. So.
And some big churches, and there was that book, the Daniel Fast, like they talk about it all the time, where they will go through and do that for a purpose or for a season, and it's a fascinating sort of thing because they pulled it straight out of Scripture.
I'm gonna show my ignorance. I don't know if the Daniel fast that was so popular, it's not just vegetables and water.
No, I think it is more than that. Yeah, I don't actually. I've never done it myself either.
The idea of setting aside a time for focusing on your health is a really good thing. I've been going through. We had Lucas, Garrett, on the podcast, and I've gone to at least part of his health project, and thinking about what we're putting into our body is really healthy, but it's not necessarily only. It's godly in the sense that it's like a discipline. Yeah, but it's not like God hates Cheetos and loves vegetables.
Yeah, he's fine with Mountain Dew occasionally, But the funny thing about it is obviously that process with him eating the way he ate was a endeavor in being set apart, right? In being continually committed to God, and yet God was raising him up as a part of that process, right? Into a season of leadership and favor and all the rest that goes along with that.
You know, it's interesting, and I wrestled with preaching this. I don't know what you would think about this. In the book of Daniel, it's very clear they're faithful and God shows them favor.
Yeah.
And that favor usually is they rise in rank, they don't burn up in the fire, they don't get eaten by the lions. We know that there are people that are faithful, and I still believe God shows them favor, but
doesn't necessarily translate into earthly success.
Earthly success. Yeah. What do you do with that? Because that's, I mean, it's a theme of Daniel. They experience God's favor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, at least for me, I see it through the lens of God had a plan for them in that season, right? He was using them specifically to walk his people through this season of captivity so that they can get to the place where they're going to get a chance to, spoiler alert, go home next week. But honestly, I as you think through all the different stories, right? Daniel gets this opportunity to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream.
Yeah.
And that's a funky dream scenario, right? We've had other dreams in the Bible. We see other dreams places, but this one's hardcore in the way that he implements it.
Yeah.
And I guess as I read these things, and I'm sure many people do, like, dreams are a reoccurring theme in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, right?
Right.
And we still have people that have dreams and they wrestle with how do you talk to people about dreams in this day and age when they're wrestling with what does it mean?
Yeah. You know, I don't have a lot of experience. I'm the guy who never remembers my dreams. Don't feel like I dream that much. So, and I have people talk to me about dreams, and I've heard enough stories. God spoke to me in a dream that I believe that can happen. Everything's got to be measured through scripture. Just anybody who comes and says, God told me this, you know, it needs to be verified through scripture, through wisdom, through other people's things. So the same is true for dreams. But, you know, in the book of Daniel, dreams are like revealing how the world's going to go kind of thing.
Yeah. From crazy statues with various forms of, you know, ankles and thighs and all the rest.
Right. Yeah. This was made out of gold. This was made out of clay.
Right.
But I mean, I've heard enough stories and even talked to people that Christ has appeared to them in a dream in maybe a Muslim majority country where they didn't have the gospel preached to them, but Jesus appeared to them in the dreams. Some of this group of people that we were helping in Lebanon, dreams like saved these guys whole tribes of people.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something there because we hear those stories coming out of those places as well. In the Bible, again and again, it's usually the dream of someone of influence.
Yeah.
And it's usually somebody else who comes in to interpret the dream with God's power. With that, on their own, they wouldn't have had a shot at it. But God is using that entire situation to either raise someone up or to,
Yeah, Joseph and Daniel have a lot of parallels. And they point to Christ in a really powerful way.
Speaking of pointing to Christ, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which they end up in a unique situation, right? They refuse to bow down, and they end up going into the furnace,
fiery furnace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it made me start to think about this idea of culture and the culture that even we live in these days that slides, and it's a little bit like, you know, what does it mean not to bow down? Because one of the things that it just leaps off the page at me with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is he says, you know, they're throwing him into the furnace. They refuse to bow down. They're throwing him into the furnace. And he says, the God who we serve is able to deliver us.
But whether he does or not.
But even if he doesn't, right.
That's the best.
Yeah, it is the best. I think for people that are wrestling with that up and to the right, like, I've been faithful. Why am I not finding favor? I've been faithful. Why am I not finding favor? Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been faithful. They are definitely not finding favor in this exact moment. And they're not even pinning their hopes on what happens in the furnace, on whether or not God is real and true and who he is, you know?
Yeah. It was do what's right, most important, not do what's right for the result you want.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what it comes down to not bowing down. It's, you know, God, it's so hard in the world that we live in because there's, you know, idolatry and idols take so many different forms.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to conform and drift into things. And
it really is. Yeah, fourth man in the fire, which we've talked about. We sing that song on Sunday. If you've ever sang that song and you're new to the faith or don't exactly know what that song is about, it comes into stark relief when you read Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And some scholars, Bible people, believe that is a pre-incarnate Christ figure. That is
theophany.
In the fire with them. That idea of Christ being with us even in those deepest and darkest moments, you know, we don't explicitly see it, but you sort of wonder, was Daniel alone in that lion's den? You know what I mean? How do you get people to embrace the presence of Christ, I would say, in their deepest trials.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love the actual promise in Jeremiah when it says you walk through the waters and not be overcome, be in the fires and not be burned. I've been in a tough season of dealing with some stuff and some interpersonal things and some organizational things, and I have had to come back to, though it's hard, Christ has not abandoned me. Janie shared with me this beautiful devotion from a book that she reads called Streams in the Desert that talks about the rose being crushed before it releases its fragrance. And so I think you've got to start with just the truth that when we're in hard times, God has not abandoned us and that we can make the best out of it.
Yeah.
But it's not hard. It's not easy to do.
Yeah.
So you hold on to those, I'm in the fire and there's a fourth man in here with me is just an awesome image.
Yeah.
I should put that in a song.
Yeah.
We sing a few songs and it's kind of like, what?
Yeah. Dry bones rattling, fourth
rattling.
man in the fire. If you're a brand new Christian, you're like, what are they talking about? That's why you need the story. That's exactly why you need the story. And so we're working our way through that. Then King Darius comes along, makes a statue of himself. Mm-hmm. And I am most intrigued by this attitude of King Darius.
Mm-hmm.
So King Darius makes this thing and says that, hey, you've got to do it. Daniel, again, does not bow down.
Yeah.
And at this point, he says he doesn't want to punish Daniel.
Yeah.
King Darius, the king of the land who made the statue and made the law, says, law's a law. You've gotten where you want me, you guys. But he literally says, in fact, I love it. His last words to Daniel are, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. Those are the last words he says to Daniel. Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den. And what does Darius do? He goes home and he fasts.
Yes.
He refuses to eat or be entertained. And he's like, I don't even know who this God is that he's, I'm sure he's got some inkling of Daniel's God. But at the end of the day, he's like, I am with Daniel on this. And I can.
And then first thing the next day, he's out there.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think it's so funny to me that the culture around us who in some way, Darius is the seat of power, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he recognizes, and in some ways that's the transition really to your notes. He recognizes that Daniel may have lived in Babylon, but Babylon didn't live in him.
Yeah.
He recognizes Daniel's all-out commitment. What was the other thing that you said? He was just firmly resolved to the things he resolved. Yeah. And there's a layer of respect that still comes out of the dominant culture when people do that. Do you see that in our world today?
I do so much. And it's hard because it's not 100%, but I see it all the time. People are looking for someone to be faithful. And when you do that, you will not always be the most popular person, but over time, you'll be the one that someone comes to and says, hey man, my marriage is falling apart.
Yeah.
Or, they might not invite you out to the party on Friday night, but when things get tough, they'll come and they will respect you. And I've seen that time and time again. I see it in high school students that get excluded from the popular crowd, but in the end, people are saying like, hey, you're the ones that are solid. I see it with adult, I definitely see it. And that's the story. It's amazing that Darius praises God and Nebuchadnezzar does it.
Nebuchadnezzar does too. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the promise. That's the covenant promise that God makes to Abraham. I'll bless you and you will be a blessing to all the people. That's the design from the beginning.
Yeah.
If you're faithful to me, not only is it going to go well for you, but it goes well for the world.
Yeah.
And Jesus Christ fulfills that. So yeah, absolutely. Faithfulness, it's hard. There's no guarantee it will be rewarded, but I can't tell you how many times in the long run you see it rewarded. Are you way on the same page here?
1,000% we are. I recently had somebody come into my life and was essentially lobbying for a position of the world that we don't adhere to in the Bible. And eventually my wife, who was involved in the circumstance, said, you didn't actually think he was going to change his mind about that, did you? Right. And it was like, no, he stands on these promises and these truths that God's I built my life around them.
Right.
And at the end of the day, it's like, just because the world is saying, hey, I think this should be looked at differently, or we need to be a little more soft on this. It's like, that's not what God's word says. That's not what a blessed life looks like. I have equated it to, and I haven't completely fleshed this out, but God's hand of blessing seems to be on us when we do things God's way. Right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, when we choose God's way, some people think, well, God is against me. I think in some ways, God's just moved his hand of blessing off of you, and you're no longer covered, and you're no longer experiencing some of the things that God had for you because you're at the will of the culture around you. You're at the will of the world around you. That's sort of been my take on it. But that's
definitely the story of Daniel.
Yes. 1,000%. And I think the real root issue, I think for most people, right? We live in a culture that is sliding away from the truth, sliding away from God's kingdom, sliding away from, in fact, you worded it real well at the beginning of this. Biblical Christianity used to be at the center,
right,
and now it's being pushed to the margins. There was a time, I think, because people were fleeing for religious persecution and all kinds of other things that started our nation, right? But being a part of a church was a given. That was, being all those other things. But now we just today talked about, in Lodi, out of the 65,000 people that are in Lodi, maybe 60,000 are not in church on Sunday.
On any given Sunday.
Yeah, so there's this idea of like, we are sliding away from the center culture. How do we hold on to the things that we know are true when the culture is screaming other things at us?
We live like Daniel.
Yeah.
We just set ourselves on our sights on we're going to follow God. And Daniel, he's not he can't be a jerk about it.
No.
Because he keeps getting promoted.
Yeah.
And he keeps getting honored.
Yeah.
So he's just like, I can't do this. I'll do I don't know how his behavior was, but he wasn't like pushing people away. He just stood out for his integrity.
Yeah.
And he rose and he rose. And eventually, even the king's like, his God.
Yeah.
That's what we need.
Yeah.
And we are seeing this in our culture. People are coming and saying there's got to be a different way.
Yeah.
And man, the church has to be ready for that. And as we live differently, it may not happen every day, but eventually the neighbor's going to ask, hey, tell me about this. Or the coworker's going to say, hey, what do you got that I don't have?
Yeah. And it is absolutely positively available to us to live in God's ways as a mid-level manager at a company, to live in God's way on the PTA at this school where all kinds of crazy ideas are going around.
Right.
Like it's really possible to stand up for what we believe in these areas. And it may not equate into the promotion. It may not equate into whatever, but I still believe it equates into God's hand of blessing and God's hand of protection hanging over us. But even if it doesn't, Shadrach,
my God delivers me or not.
Yeah,
okay.
I will continue to live that way. One of the things you talked about is Daniel is consistent in the habits that allow him to experience God's favor. How do we encourage people to keep those habits in their life?
Right. Well, I think it's some of that we just see the spiritual disciplines in Daniel's life and the others' lives that are his foundation. When it says Daniel knelt 3 times a day to pray, just as he always had.
Yeah.
Daniel faces this thing. He asked us to pray. So you just see his response is to turn to God. And that's habitual.
Yeah.
That's habitual. And there's no real shortcut, but I'm going to spend my time doing that. I'm going to make sure my foundation is God's word. I'm going to spend quiet time in prayer. I'm going to surround myself with spiritually good influences. I'm going to worship. I'm going to give. I'm going to serve, and then if we do those things regularly, when the fiery furnace comes, we've got a foundation that we can fall back on.
You mentioned it earlier. I too have been going through a season of difficulty with both personal and professional, I would argue. But I've been wrestling through it. And it's so funny to me, my morning bike rides with God,
you love it.
They get longer and longer. like I'm just like, I think I'd rather stay here.
We get it, Steve. We see you riding all around town. People are like,
I think I'd rather stay here with you, God, than go in and face what I have to face today. But there's a truth in that, like that habit becomes like it's just so core to what I need to survive this day, if that makes sense, that I can't walk away from it. I can't overlook it. I can't do without it. And it's sort of fun. This is just a small little anecdotal thing, but we were out yesterday at Top Golf, and we were going there to celebrate.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, we were celebrating my new son-in-law Kyle's birthday this week. We were out there at Top Golf, and we're swinging golf clubs, and they're delivering the nachos and the stuff that you get at Top Golf. And immediately we all are going to dig in when Hannah goes, "Wait, aren't we going to pray?"
Nice.
And I'm like, yeah, I don't know why in that environment I was just like, I'm just gonna eat but my daughter, for her, this is the habit. It's not this is what we do, and it's who we are, and she doesn't care who's sitting in the booth next to you or even with you. And so I think staying faithful to those habits, I think, is really key to staying grounded in your faith so that you can withstand the culture around you.
Right. Boy, and I mean, that's just such a great example too. Obviously Hannah had seen that a lot of times growing up, but people are watching.
They are.
People are watching, and they, it may be weird to them, but not everybody, but people are going to be drawn to it and want something different. So it's okay to be a little different.
Absolutely. Well, I would argue the world needs different right now.
The world needs different.
Yeah, the same ain't working. So the last thing you wrote is Daniel trusts in God's great plan, even when it's hard to see. And eventually you're going to end up in Jeremiah 29:11, which is I love the verse, and it's my pet peeve verse at the same time, But there's a layer of hope that exists not only in Daniel's heart, but also in God's people, as Jeremiah, proclaims this to them. You know what I mean? How do you hold on to hope when you're in an oppressive culture around you? Because I guarantee you there's somebody out there right now who's going to work every day, and work is oppressive, like hostile to their faith, hostile to their character. There's somebody at school right now, whether it's a high school student, a junior high student, a teacher, that is struggling to, how do I live this out? Like, how do you give them hope in the midst of that oppressive environment to live out what God has called us to live out?
Well, a couple of things I would say is, if that's you and you're filled with that, you need to get in some places where that is not the case. You need to get into a small group.
Place to breathe.
Place to breathe. You need to be faithful in church where, you can see that there's a different way, even if it strengthens you to face what you're going to face. But then we have hope that God makes all things right in the end, ultimately. And we see this, actually, we don't really cover the prophecy in the book of Daniel, but their second half of the book of Daniel, which we're not talking about, is all the prophecy of future things.
It's all story at the beginning of prophecy.
If I could just summarize it, is God wins in the end.
Yeah, right.
And that's the hope that they have. Because in Jeremiah, it's like, in 70 years you'll return. Most of the people who heard that are going to be dead in 70 years. And it's their, but God still wins. So the other thing that I would say too is the beginning part of Jeremiah 29 says, what is it? It says, get married, plant gardens, build houses. It doesn't say you have to run away from the culture. You can follow Christ.
Bless the
California,
city.
Bless and be a blessing to the city, and pray for the city, and be a positive part of the culture. But for that person who's really struggling, I would say, remember how God sees things, but then you got to get into a place that's going to remind you of that daily.
Can you imagine a city without believers that are injecting hope into it? A city like Lodi without grace and mercy, without, I'm talking about feeding people, without, all the people who are working for good things in various parts of our culture and our society, 180 and all these other nonprofits that do good things. Salvation Army, all kinds of them, it would be a very hopeless place.
If you believe in a rapture and then a tribulation, that's what happens. The church is raptured out, and then the church is gone, and the tribulation comes.
But as a result, we traffic in hope. We're like drug dealers when it comes to hope, and so that's, and I feel like that's the word that we need to give to people is that we are not only blessed to be a blessing, but that blessing is to give people hope that are struggling. And so we do that again and again and again in the culture around us.
Thankful for the book of Daniel.
Oh, absolutely. Thankful for the book, and for Daniel as a person, and for Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, and for these kings. Like Nebuchadnezzar basically goes, your God must be God. King Darius says, I think I'll fast to your God, not to, like, we see people in influence who are reached because of faithfulness in some of those lower circles. Well, that is our story for this week. It's a great story. If you get a chance to read it, you could probably read the whole book of Daniel if you wanted to this week. Obviously, chapter 18, I think it is.
Yes, chapter 18.
Chapter 18 in the story. And we'd love for you to discuss that in your community groups and figure out, how do we live this out in our world? How do we become people of steady faithfulness, obedience? What was the other one in the beginning? You said faithfulness, obedience, and then promise. The kingdom will endure and descendant will reign on the throne throne forever was God's covenant with David. But we have that promise firmly established. And like you said, Daniel, the second half shows us that promise again. So God bless you as you engage in the story this week and get a chance to discuss it with others and hopefully live it out in our culture today.